Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Lunch and Learn. We're going to get started in just a couple of moments. Thank you for your patience while we wait for our other friends to join us. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes while we wait for our other friends to join. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're going to get started in about a minute. Thanks for joining us early. We really appreciate that. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Levine, and I'm the Manager of Adult Services for Programs and Outreach at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of Lunch and Learn in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. And now I'll turn it over to Bert to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone to the Lunch and Learn lecture. Our partners, the Maryland State Archives and the Enoch Pratt Free Library, are working closely with us to showcase the best new research into Maryland's history. We at the Maryland's 4 Centuries Project are joining our partners to recognize that this history goes back before the colony and state that grew from European settlement. In creating our Maryland mosaic, searching for Maryland's firsts, both in the state and also in the nation since 1776, we faced a serious challenge since many firsts for the indigenous people who lived on this land happened before 1776. These first people were living successfully on the land for thousands of years. The Europeans arrived in the early 17th century, and by 1800, the Indian settlements had been driven out, and the indigenous people were either driven totally out of Maryland or pushed into hiding in forests, swamps, and marshlands. The Maryland Indians lost their lands, and those who still live among us are in a diaspora. The tribes remain sovereign nations in spite of official attempts to erase their existence. Now, we are here today to welcome new attempts to revive the history and culture of Maryland Indians so long neglected. Those Maryland communities include the Piscataway Indians, the Cedarville Band of Indians, the Chopticco Band of Indians, all of southern Maryland, the Accahannock Indian Tribe, the Nanacoke Tribe, the Pocomoke Indian Nation, the Mayaisuwàk Band of Indians, all of the Eastern Shore, the Susquehannock Tribe, coming from Pennsylvania, the Youghiogheny River Band of Shawnees in Western Maryland, as well as the North Carolina Lumbees, now of Baltimore. Except for their place names that now dot the landscape, they're all but out of sight and out of mind. The Maryland State Archives staff has led the way, searching out early records in the archive's extensive collection that chronicle the troubled colonial government relations with Maryland tribes. The result has been Mayis, M-A-Y-I-S, an Indigenous Records Guide. This is an attractive new destination on the archive's website that features the reproduced documents. You can see and study their actual appearance. Mayis, M-A-Y-I-S, the new guide, is an indigenous word meaning path to go. It's a fitting title for the revival of old neglected references. The Archives Records Project has now been joined by an ambitious effort to search out the Eastern Shore's surviving modern tribal communities. This oral history project, OTHP, with another Indian title, They Speak with One Voice, is being led by today's speaker, Drew Shuptar-Rayvis. He also has the indigenous name of Blue Corn, is a citizen and the elected cultural ambassador of the Pocomoke Indian Nation. He's very proud of his mixed, true American background with a family lineage that not only has indigenous Pocomoke, but also Pennsylvania Dutch, Welsh, Swiss, English, Scots-Irish, Boyko-Ukraine, and an Ashkenazi Sephardic Jewish heritage. I would very much enjoy seeing a DNA wheel chart of his ancestry. Drew is working on the research and preservation of Algonkian Eastern Woodland languages, but I particularly appreciate his work as a living historian, a colonial reenactor, and an interpreter. So please welcome a lively representative of the new generation of public historians, Drew Shuptar-Rayvis.
Hey, Natadawansi, Pekatawas MakataWai'U. Pocomoke Indian Nation ne. Wanishi nach binekio na kinawung nach bi Wakasko swing Walekishku. Natadawansi, Pekatawas MakataWai'U. I am called Black Corn. Pocomoke Indian Nation ne. Pocomoke person and man I am. Wanishi, thank you. Nach bi na nekio na kinawung. Thank you. Thank you, and I'm thankful for you and I, for us. Wakasko swing walikishku. The day is good. My name is Drew Shuptar-Rayvis. I am a citizen and cultural ambassador of the Pocomoke Indian Nation. I'm a graduate of Western Connecticut State University, graduating with a degree in anthropology, sociology, and from Western Connecticut State University, and a certificate degree in archaeology from Norwalk Community College. I'm an Algonkian living historian of the 17th and 18th century, and a contractual research and preservation specialist with Maryland State Archives. I am also the Algonkian historical consultant for the New Amsterdam History Center of New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for all of those who could attend. I'm beyond humbled and honored to talk to you about my work with T.O.H.P, the Oral History Project, Mayis, and some of the highlights from collecting oral histories from Maryland's Eastern Shore tribal communities. Though our time is limited and there is so much to cover today, I would like to talk to you about what Mayis and T.O.H.P are and why they are so unique and important, as well as the reasons why we conducted this work to tell a more inclusive and present tense conversation about Native American communities within the state of Maryland and Delmarva Peninsula. So we have a map that's here of Delmarva Peninsula. So peninsula is a jut of land that is surrounded by water. Delmarva Peninsula is unique because it comprises 3 states. So to the north, the south, the east, and the west is the state, what's known as the Eastern Shore of Maryland, state of Maryland. That's right here. We can see that on our map. To the northeast is the state of Delaware, and to the south is the state of Virginia. So these 3 states and the ones surrounding it are on the eastern coast of the United States, known as the Southern Mid-Atlantic. What's really interesting about Delmarva Peninsula is that it's surrounded by 3 different bodies of water that are really critical and crucial bodies of water. So to the northeast, you have the Delaware Bay. To the east and southeast, you have the Atlantic Ocean. And to the to the west and to the northwest, you have the Chesapeake Bay. That's here. Delmarva Peninsula is also bordered by 3 different states. So to the northeast, you have southern New Jersey. That's here. To the north and west, and to the is the state of Pennsylvania. To the west is the western shore of Maryland. That's right here. And to the south, you have what's known as Tidewater, Virginia. So the landscape in Delmarva Peninsula is very unique. It's very, very flat. It is very agricultural. So there's a lot of soy and corn as the chief agricultural products. A lot of chicken plants. There's a lot of what are known as chicken houses that are there. It's where a lot of our Purdue, Mountain Air, it's where a lot of those processing plants are. The land is very, very flat. The forest structure is flat. Typically, the predominant trees are loblolly, sweet gum, and holly. Though historically that forest structure was different, it is also a land of immense marshlands, wetlands, waterways, rivers, streams, tidal zones, and is sea level. So very, very susceptible to tides and very, very susceptible to rising seas. So what is Mayis and T.O.H.P? So for many people, what we know about the past is through primary sources and records. These documents, penned by our forebears centuries ago, let us view a world now vanished to the pages of time. Documents which help us understand the world, conflicts, economies, treaties, peoples, land patents, and government. These records are also vital for Indigenous Americans trying to understand their tribal histories, learn more about their ancestors, and reclaim their treaties made with their colonial governments. Up until recently, many of these documents had scantily been transcribed, and the few that had were locked in hard copies. Those that had been digitized lived on servers and databases that were not easily accessible. Since 2019, many Maryland State Archives began the long process of digitizing hundreds of Indigenous records and then transferring them to a more user-friendly database with the help and consultation of tribal communities. In 2022, Maryland State Archives was able to launch the Mayis database. The name Mayis, meaning a path to go on in the Lenape dialect of the Algonkian language, a dialect that was spoken historically on Maryland's eastern shore, was chosen with help from the Pocomoke Indian Nation to better encapsulate what the project aimed to do, be a path for researchers and descendants to find records and documents pertaining to Native Americans. Mayis is a massive database of Native American records in the state of Maryland and beyond, because you have to remember in the colonial period, many colonial governments claimed land and territories that now belong to other states and other places. And so we have some records in Mayis that are from southeastern Pennsylvania because at that time, in say the middle 1600s, Maryland was claiming that area of land and considered it part of Maryland, though now we would not consider it that. So these records include treaties, land patents, depositions, court records, and many others dating from the colony's inception in 1634, and has records that are transcribed from, as late as the early 19th century, though that aims to change. So let's see if we can get onto this. I don't think we can. If we can get onto the website, it's very, very navigational. Unfortunately, I'm not able to click onto there. I'm not able to share my screen, but unfortunately, so the website is very, very navigable. You can follow this link, and it has sections for browsing. It has sections about, and it has sections about in documents. So you can go, okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. See if I can. I'm going to try to share my screen, see if I can figure that out. I apologize. Great. Now I just got to figure out how to share my screen, which I apologize. I am not great with technology, believe it or not. I'm much better doing oral histories.
If you go to present, it should be the first option right there.
Share screen. Okay, thank you so much. I apologize, everyone. Okay, so can everyone see?
Yes, we can see.
Great. So here's the Mayis website. What's really great about it, it's very easy to navigate. So on the home screen, you can see to the far right, images of contemporary Native American communities on Delmarva's Peninsula from Maryland's Eastern Shore. You might see some familiar faces. You can also find land acknowledgements. You can go all the way down, see where documents are, data updates, oral histories, which will tell us about the project that we are talking about today. So how does this website work? I've always been someone who I'm fascinated with systems, fascinated with things, fascinated with how things work. So how does this website work? So say I was curious about, I wanted to learn more about it. Well, I could click on the About link. I can go down. I can read about how the site was named. I can read how to pronounce it, about its dedication. I can go into thanks. But say I'm looking about documents, right? I want to go to browse. Or I want to go to, if I want to go to browse, which not allowing me to do that right now. But if I want to go to documents, well, there's browse. So it gives you alphabetically. It says browser alphabetic index of terms about tribal people and places found in our current database of Maryland government documents. Now, remember, this database is constantly improving. It's constantly being updated. So more and more things over the years are being added. Many indigenous terms are found in documents with different spellings. Select the first term listed on the left to see the related spellings. If you select an alternative spelling, you'll see only that spelling across from our records. So it goes in alphabetical order. So you could go and look and search for a river or a people and find it there. But that might be a little cumbersome. What about the documents? Documents are really important, especially when we're looking at treaties, land sales, depositions. So it gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's about 6 different communities that are listed here with documents attributed to them. So let's just look at the Pocomoke, right? So we've got the treaty between Maryland and the Assateague and Pocomoke nations. This is October 22nd, 1722. So you've got 2 different options here. You could go to the transcription. So I could press page 1 and look at that. That is the digitized, transcribed version of that treaty. And you can find all the pages of it here and read it in modern English. But say that doesn't suit you, right? And I want to see the original document. All I have to do is click View Item Page. And look at that. I can find the original document. What's great about these, sometimes they have original marks, which Native American people for the longest time did not have signatures like Europeans. And so they would have marks that symbolize, they would be from tattoos or they would symbolize other things. And that's how they would sign things. And occasionally we do have a few documents that have, they were known as marks and that have these people's marks that are on the page. So you can go here and look up and find these documents that have been transcribed. So resources, that's another important part of this website. So one of the things that a lot of communities talk about is that, we always constantly find that people have a hard time contacting tribal communities. And so what's great about the resources page, it lists all of Maryland's tribal communities within the state, and it lists their tribal websites. So if I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, I'm in the film industry, what have you, and I'm interested in contacting these local tribes, looking for a land acknowledgement, looking for tribal participation in a project, all you have to do is click on one of these websites. We'll just use my community, the Pocomoke Indian Nation. Click on that website, and bam, there you go. You are on the Pocomoke Indian Nation tribal website. You can find where the contact is and contact the community in question. So now I'm going to go back to my slides. So after the website was launched in 2022 and into 2023, the directors behind Mayis realized that though these documents that we just showed you through Mayis were immensely important, that there was something critically missing. This was a contemporary component of today's Maryland tribal communities. In 2022, it was decided to seek grant funding through the Maryland Heritage Areas to make what was a two-dimensional site into a three-dimensional one. This created T.O.H.P, the Oral History Project, which is pronounced Top, which happened to be the phonetic pronunciation of the Algonkian word for friend. In late May of 2023, I was hired by Maryland State Archives to be the contractual research and preservation specialist for T.O.H.P. The grant which funded the project focused itself on Maryland's Eastern Shore. However, Maryland State Archives believed that the borders between states were arbitrary, so some of the communities we contacted were in what is now modern-day Delaware, because the community, the Nanticoke Indian tribe, had historically lived in Maryland and had relocated to Delaware in the 18th century. So, as I had said, Maryland State Archives viewed that this border between states was arbitrary. This is still Delmarva Peninsula, though the main focus of our grant was Maryland's Eastern Shore. Maryland's Eastern Shore, as we said earlier, is a place of vast marshland, tidal zones, farmland, flat forest, and long memories. To record the oral histories, lifeways, local recollections of Maryland's Eastern Shore tribal communities, this project originally set itself to take place from July through to December 31st, 2023. But eventually was extended to mid-April of 2024. This project was an immense success, and we were able to record at least 20 individuals from various tribal communities. The communities that participated were, as we see, this is the Pocomoke Indian Nation. So the maps I'm using here are from Maryland State's Arts Council. So the Arts Council is another great state website that gives land acknowledgements, tribal homelands, territories, and it gives maps for these. Now, these maps aren't perfect, some of them, but they are a great way to start, and they are more or less generally factual. So if we look here, we can see where the Pocomoke Indian Nation is and where their tribal territory is. We can see where the Mayaisuwàk Band of Indians, their territory borders the Choptank River and the Chesapeake Bay. We can see where the Ocohonics are in the lower Eastern Shore into the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And we can see where Millsboro is. So this is the Nanticoke Indian tribe who's in Millsboro, who's right above that Maryland Eastern Shore border. A lot of their community live in Millsboro and live in surrounding areas, but also on this Indian River, which is right here. The tribe formed in 1888. And one of the cool things that they did was that their people bought land, and they kept land in the family, and they had this huge power base of land that was passed through family members. In the early summer of 2023, proposals were made to tribal communities about participation in the project. Tribal communities were contacted for participation via phone calls and emails as far as southern New Jersey and the Eastern Shore of Virginia. Due to the traditional nature of many of these communities, it was incredibly important to bring gifts of tobacco to tribal leadership and to speak to their tribal councils and community meetings in person about why they should participate. Impassioned oratory and the promise of safety in all aspects of the project and in whatever they chose to share, fairness in ensuring that they were compensated fairly, and the swearing of an oath to protect all communities that I interviewed from having any information from being manipulated or misused was incredibly effective. Interviews were all conducted in person and took place in people's homes, but also tribal centers, culturally significant sites, homelands, as well as the occasional public location. Because I did one interview in a restaurant. Great care was taken to ensure tribal citizens were comfortable with audio recordings that were taken, and all steps to provide data sovereignty, copies of interview transcriptions were made available to tribal citizens. Tribal citizens also had the right to edit their recordings or re-record their recordings if they were unsatisfied before any official submission was made. Maryland State Archives desired from the beginning to ensure that tribal community members who wished to participate in Mayis or T.O.H.P were well compensated for their time and participation. Each participant had the opportunity to collect a stipend of $250, though once they collected the stipend, the individuals had the choice of keeping the stipend for their own needs, or, once personally acquired, donating it to their tribal communities, to their own tribal communities, which did happen in several instances. However, though monetary compensation was largely accepted by many, some participants chose to waive their right to a stipend, but also some did not find compensation in a monetary form agreeable. It was decided, upon consultation with Maryland State Archives and myself, that a traditional gift should be created. In many Native American communities, sharing knowledge, history, culture, language is a great sign of respect and trust. That being said, the exchange of Western forms of currency can seem to some communities as inappropriate and devaluing the importance and culturally sensitive nature of the information they chose to share. To address this, as you guys see here, it was my as you can see, it was my recommendation in the midwinter of 2024 that tobacco, as you can see in this bag here, red cloth, which is used traditionally to wrap the tobacco, either making ties, or you can take the tobacco, putting it into a small Ziploc bag, and you wrap the bag with red cloth, which is a traditional practice. Red is a symbol of life, vitality for many Eastern woodland cultures, and it's still used to wrap sacred or important objects. And so we did that. We bought the red cloth, we bought the tobacco, and we also purchased glass wampum beads that were used to make in the necklaces. These necklaces were to symbolize friendship with the state archives and tribal communities and their participants. To be purchased, all of this was to be purchased to use as traditional gifts to show honor and respect for participants' time and their desire to share with us. So gifting is very important in Eastern woodland cultures, and it was one of those things that Maryland State Archives, through no fault of their own, did not understand. As I'd stated earlier, some of the communities felt that monetary compensation was a little bit on the level of disrespectful, and so traditional gifts were seen as very, very acceptable. Wampum for Eastern woodland people is a very important object. Traditionally, wampum, which derives itself from the word wampum peg or wampum peak, which is a Narragansett word. In the Eastern Shore, the word we have is peak, means white shell bead. Originally, wampum is made from the quahog shell, which is a clam, and the whelk shell, which is a ocean snail. We would take the center column of the whelk and cut those into rectangles and then grind them down and drill them out and make beads. It's a very long process. We also made Roanoke, which is a round bead made from white clamshell, which was very common on the Eastern Shore. Wampum has a lot of deep socio-spiritual significance in Eastern woodland societies and communities. Socio-spiritual meaning both significance in society and spirituality. So though these beads are glass, and glass beads were used in the 18th century, the 1700s, the symbol of the wampum beads was was taken with a lot of respect, and it was incredibly appreciative. And many tribes expressed how appreciative they were to receive it. These gifts were seen as very agreeable, and many community members were incredibly appreciative to receive them. The level of respect was seen and felt. Most of the participants in this project were older individuals, ranging both male and female from 60 to 96, with only a minority of individuals under that bracket. For Algonkian people on Delmarva's Peninsula, homelands are seen in a song line of stories. Each place, creek, marsh, field, and building occupying a memory that was culturally significant. Often, many conversations were had and were dubbed rambles, where myself and the informants would be in a car telling stories about their homelands. Informal recordings such as these were vital in understanding the continuation of traditions, customs, memories, and ancestors of Eastern Shore's native people. It is also greatly established trust and respect that the state desired to meet Indigenous Americans individuals on their own terms. These rambles were really great. We got a lot of different and varying stories. I would just be, like I said, I would be in the car with individuals and we would be traveling to different locations that were culturally relevant. We would also be telling stories. I would be shown and pointed out places on the landscape that were all connected to these different stories and people and family members. The issue we had with some of the 11 questions, which we'll go into in a short little while, was that they were kind of limiting with the conversations we could have. And so by having more of a kind of free conversation, there was a lot more things that we could talk about, a lot more things that could be expressed. And once these oral histories are published, I think the public will get a lot of depth and a lot of texture from these ramble conversations that they might not get, or not get to the entirety with the official 11 questions which we gave to tribal participants. What was learned? Maryland State Archives was so fortunate to have a wealth of knowledge shared with us, though there was a standard set of 11 questions. And the 11 questions that we gave were, is there a particular tradition that your ancestors did that is maintained either in your family or tribal community? If not, have you reclaimed them? Is there anything you feel or see in your territory that is threatened or endangered that has cultural significance? Buildings, these could be buildings, cemeteries, hunting/fishing areas, ceremonial grounds, historical and culturally significant areas. Question 3 was, what do you feel the public and the government misunderstands the most about you and your community? What life ways, crafts, hunting, fishing, crabbing, dance do you feel are most important in your community and link you to your ancestors? With this question, I'll add, because Delmarva Peninsula is, its water is on both sides and it's vast marshland, tidal zones. Things like fishing, crabbing, oystering, clamming are very big industries, and they're huge lifeways for Native American people on the Eastern Shore. So crabbing is one of those things that's very, very important. There are crabs there, Maryland blue crab, which is delicious. And it's a traditional food, and it's also one that has great economic value and is a lifeway for many people. What do you feel the state misunderstands about you and your community? Is there anything you would like to correct on record? Is there any specific location in your territory that you feel holds the most cultural significance? How have things changed since you were a child, where you grew up? Have you always lived in your homelands? Are there any lifeways that you feel are threatened? What are they, and how would you like them preserved? What traditions do you remember your elders telling you? If you could have one wish granted for the future of your community, what would it be? And the 11th question was, what does it mean to you to be Indigenous in what is now Maryland or Delmarva Peninsula? What does it mean to you? What does it mean for you to be an Indigenous person in the state you live in? So all the answers that we got from these questions were vastly different. As one can imagine, we had many different ages. We had people in their 90s and people in their 60s, both male and female. Though many of the answers that we got intersected, all of this being from a wide range of ages and sexes and experiences. One of the most intersecting was how landscape had changed and how climate change, sea level rise, and the change and loss of species had greatly affected them. For Eastern Shore Native people, homelands are situated on the ground that is sea level, which means that it's right there. It's so flat that there are many places on the Eastern Shore where the tide comes in and roads are flooded out, to give you an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about sea level, where roads sometimes become impassable. They're on sea level. And current scientific research has shown that Eastern Shore Maryland is gradually sinking beneath the ocean, and that sea level rise should increase by a foot in the next 50 years and 6 feet by the end of the century. Because of this, culturally sensitive areas and culturally significant areas are greatly threatened. Many communities talked about species of plants and animals of cultural importance. Once prolific and now a shadow, such as the cattail plant, which we don't have an image here, but anybody can go onto Google and go and look up what a cattail plant is. I'm sure many people on this call have seen a cattail plant at least once in their life. But for those of you who don't know, cattail is a native grass found in the marshlands and waterways of much of eastern North America. It has a multitude of uses. It's a food, it's a medicine, was used by many communities for making mats for their bedding, for their homes. In Delmarva Peninsula and Maryland's eastern shore, the cattail was culturally significant to the Pocomoke, who used them to make duck decoys, used them as food, medicine, and historically wove mats of them to cover their homes, and also wove mats for their bedding. Once a common plant on the eastern shore, it has become a vanishing ghost of former times, outcompeted by invasive phragmite reeds. So there is a native phragmite reed. It's a when we're talking invasive phragmite reed, it is a spindly reed with a flowery seed head, where cattails have a very round, thick seed pod that looks like a round cat's tail. These invasive phragmite reeds, which were brought, some say in the 17 or 1800s, from Asia or from Europe, which it's a Eurasian plant, so it exists in both places. There's even an Australian variety as well. It's incredibly invasive, and it really dominates waterbound landscapes. So these invasive phragmite reeds, which once established in a wetland environment, is almost impossible to eradicate or control. Many communities told me of numerous fish, animal and plant species which were once abundant in their youth, such as wild asparagus, strawberries, muskrat, and the American shad, but due to poor land management, overfishing, and rising warming seas, waterways, and drastically warming winters, has caused them to disappear or greatly diminish. So some of the animals we have here, because we'll talk about two, are the shad, the American shad, and the muskrat that are here. So shad is a anadromous fish. So anadromous means it's a fish that goes to fresh water and migrates to fresh water to spawn, meaning goes there to mate and produce more fish, but then returns back to the ocean and spends the vast majority of its life cycle in the ocean. Shad, historically for Eastern woodland people, was an incredibly valuable and important food source, to the point that it was a part of people's calendars. So for Algonkian people, they are like the Chinese and the Jews. They are lunar cycle people. So they tell time by the phases of the moon. So for the Pocomoke, they have a moon called an Apawasho na Chaham, which means the shad moon. It means the moon when the shad returns upstream, which is in March. It's the first full moon of March. Shad, when they go upstream, migrated in the hundreds of thousands. Many Europeans write about the shad and alewife migrations into different waterways throughout the eastern United States by the hundreds of thousands, to the point where the water was moving and alive. Shad is a very oily, very kind of mushy meat fish. It was traditionally dried, pounded into a meal, and dried and eaten, and reconstituted in water. But it was a very important food source for Eastern woodland people. However, it became an important food source for colonial settlers as well. By the 19th century and the 20th century, shad became a seasonal delicacy in many parts of the mid-Atlantic. And the most delicacy part of that fish was the shad roe. One of our informants from the Pocomoke Indian Nation told us about how in his youth he remembered people harvesting the shad only for the roe. The roe is where all the eggs are, which is how the fish makes more fish. And the fish doesn't have roe, can't make more fish. And so overfishing and overharvesting and bad environmental management caused the shad to decline. But also damming of rivers, changing of waterways, changing of migrational paths for these fish, because they need to spawn upriver. They weren't able to do that. And so these fish were no longer able to spawn in places that they're able to spawn. And now many places are having issues trying to have the shad come back and return. and they're having many issues. Very few places in the eastern United States still have a shad run, and it changes depending where you are in the eastern United States. I live in the Hudson Valley of New York. That's where I'm presenting today. And eastern shore of Maryland is about 3 weeks ahead of us where we are in the summer, and 3 weeks behind us where we are in the winter. So it's, of course, different where we are. But shad is one of these fish that was a huge, huge lifeway. It was a food source for Native American people and colonial and African American people that were there that, unfortunately, due to bad management practices, has diminished incredibly. The muskrat is another animal that, though many eastern woodland people ate this animal, used its pelt to make blankets, bags, a variety of other objects. Muskrats are one of these animals and lifeways that are culturally defining for the Nayaisuwàk band of Indians in Dorchester County. They have a ancestral and generational tradition of trapping the muskrats every winter season and harvesting their meats and harvesting their hides to sell the pelts and also to consume the meat. However, and I have a fur trapping license as well. One of the things that you learn about muscelids, so beavers, muskrats are in the muscelid family of water-bound mammals that have a musk to them. They also have these thick coats. One of the things about muskrats and beavers, they have this brown outer coat, which is their outer coat, and they have this dense inner fur, which historically these pelts were very desirable because they would be used to make felts, to make fur felt hats, which in the 1600s was high fashion for Europeans. But these animals are very important to the lifeways of many native people. However, with fur-bearing animals, you need very cold winters to produce thick, good furs. And unfortunately, because of climate change and because of environmental changes, the winters have been incredibly mild in Delmarva Peninsula. And the complaints or the concerns I've gotten from members of the Nayaisuwàk community when we were doing this project was that they were talking about how the furs of the animals were not nearly as good as what they were in the past, and that because of warming waters, because of warming temperatures, muskrats were not as abundant as they were in the past. In the days of their fathers and their grandfathers, they talked about harvesting muskrats by the hundreds of the thousands, filling up the backs of pickup trucks in big, huge heaps. And now they're lucky if they get 20 or 30. So muskrats are one of these things that, because of a changing environment, changing climate, are threatened. Another great loss for communities was forest, now claimed by saltwater marsh. These forests, who are extremely susceptible to salt water, have, because of rising tides, been flooded by brackish water. These forests, who thrive on fresh water when they're alive, become known as ghost forests. So this was a constant story among the Pocomoke, the Nayaisuwàk. Many tribal communities told me about ghost forests. I had many citizens of the Pocomoke Indian Nation tell me about ghost forests and how ghost forests have increased since the time of their childhood, the time of their youth. And we'll talk a little bit now about kind of how they form and what are they. These forests, when alive, once provided a habitat for deer, fox, squirrels, numerous berry bushes, medicinal and edible plants, as well as places of human habitation in historic times. Among the Pocomoke, they talked about settlements, places where people were buried on some of this land that was very culturally important to them. But due to bad environmental policies from the early and mid-20th century and rising seas, these forests, once flooded by salt water, sicken and die. The land, which before flooding has breathing layers of topsoil, which is why plants such as berry bushes, medicinal plants, and all these other, edible plants or flowering plants are able to survive and able to thrive in that landscape because of those breathing layers of topsoil. They become, when once flooded, incredibly compacted and laden with silt. This silt, combined with the salt water, stifles and suffocates all other plant growth, allowing only salt-resistant marsh grass to grow. In essence, an ever-expanding marsh in an ever-shrinking forest, as we can see here in this picture of a ghost forest in Dorchester County, Maryland. There are hundreds of acres of these ghostly shadows of forest all over Delmarva Peninsula, and every waterway has them, reminding the communities of what was. So oftentimes, I would drive down, through the Eastern Shore, and like I said, every river from the Nanacoke to the Choptank to the Pocomoke, you can go and you can see, particularly on the Nanacoke and the Choptank, you can see these ghost forests that stretch in about an acre in, if not more. And you can see, and it's this huge swath of these dead trees. And it wasn't always like that. At one time, that ground was above. That ground was away from the sea, was away from that salt water. But once that salt water gets in there, compacts the land, nothing can grow, and it just makes more marsh. So it kind of makes an ecological desert. The forest provided all these different things. It provided habitat for all these things. And with, the rise of sea level and the rise of salt water going into these trees and these waterways, it destroys that ecology, destroys that biome, which is really, really detrimental. We even know eagles, and the urine produced by eagles kills pine trees, which the Mayaisuwàk told Environmental Protection Agency for a very long time, and it's only recently that they listened to the Mayaisuwàk community and found that to be true. But eagles will even have the ability for peeing on trees, urinating on trees, will kill the tree over time because of the salts that get into the tree. So ghost forests are one of these things that are very detrimental in this territory, and once they're formed, there's no way to really revert it back. Though there was a collective sense that things had gotten better for tribal citizens since they were young, and that there were places, activities, and traditions that were still maintained and were culturally defining, many tribes also expressed a bitter feeling of erasure. For centuries, Maryland's Eastern Shore indigenous population faced incredible prejudice, colonial violence, and other inhibiting factors that prevented an overt, vibrant, and outspoken cultural continuity. Now, the Nanacoke are very different. They formed their community in 1888 and had powwows consistently up until the 1940s, and then revived those powwows in the 1970s. But they had a very different history and a very different life way than Lower Eastern Shore tribal communities. So for Maryland's Lower Eastern Shore tribal communities, though not all hid their identities in public, many of them expressed in their oral histories of relaying their ancestry, traditions, lifeways, language within the privacy of their homes and amongst family members. Many historians and government agencies in the past wrote the Indians off, saying they were no longer living in the Eastern Shore, but this was not the truth. So you have to remember, for the longest time as Eastern Woodland people, it wasn't cool to be Native, and it wasn't a good thing to be Native. I had one citizen from the Mayaisuwàk who had flatly told me that at one time it was worse to be Native than it was to be Black. And this was something he had heard from his elders in the 50s. So people were very terrified of the prejudice. They were very scared of the discrimination. And they kept a lot of that information very, very close to people they trusted. And they kept it very closed off to the public, not saying that all of them hid their identity, but they were very careful with whom they shared it with. And so many communities, as I had stated, kept it within their families and kept it within their tribal communities. And up until recently, really didn't share it too much with the public. Despite prejudice, injustice, and multiple fronts stretching back to the colonial period and numerous other factors, Maryland's tribal communities still persist and thrive. However, many tribes on Maryland's Eastern Shore feel forgotten or invisible by the public and government at large. Some expressed a feeling of tokenization. They expressed a desire to be included more into the conversation, for the public to feel free to reach out to tribal communities through their emails and websites. but also asked the public to come out to their cultural events and learn about the cultural heritage of the area they live in by the people who've always lived there. This project was a monumental move for the state of Maryland. This project is unique in its scope and backed by a database unmatched in the Mid-Atlantic region and is a crowning achievement. It was one of the greatest honors and privileges of my life to work on this project. What is most humbling is to know that these voices shall echo for eternity, and that this knowledge that has been vetted and shared freely and with full cooperation of tribal communities shall help future descendants and citizens better understand themselves and their ancestors. No longer shall they be lost, but a path shall guide them home. Wanishi, thank you, and you give me great honor. I apologize for any technical inconvenience. Like I said, I'm much better at oral histories than I am at digital presentations. So I believe now we have time for questions that the public has.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Drew. That was really amazing. We do have some questions that came in over the course of your presentation. Edward says, we work across the Chesapeake watershed. Do other states in the watershed have any other similar databases to Mayis? Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, New York, or DC?
So as far as I know, and I would absolutely say, Edward, please contact the state archives that you're curious about. As far as I know, no. Maryland is unique in its database of Mayis. I have not seen any database that's similar to it. Now, New England might, because New England has a lot of federal tribal communities. They very well might have something similar. But as far as the Mid-Atlantic is concerned, and like I said, I would really contact those state agencies just to be sure. But as far as I'm aware, no. Mayis is very unique and is something that's only found in Maryland. However, what's cool with Mayis is that because it holds Maryland's colonial records, the colony of Maryland was a lot bigger than what it is today. So we have records that come from Pennsylvania. We have records that are, parts of places in Virginia because they were claimed by Maryland at different times. So you might find records in Mayis that cover different states, believe it or not.
Cool, thank you. Sam would like to know, how did you come up with the 11 interview questions for the oral history participants?
That's a really good question. And I came up with it on a summer day. But it was one of those things that, I thought about, about lifeways, and I thought about, things that, because I kind of thought of my community first. And I thought about what are kind of the things that come up in conversations with my tribe? What are kind of the things that come up in conversation with our sister community, the Mayaisuwàk Band of Indians. And so I kind of took a lot of those things that I had heard in conversation. So feelings of erasure, feelings of things that people want the government and the public to know about them from themselves, from their own voices. What kind of traditions and lifeways are people maintaining, or what ones have they lost but that they remember? And so I kind of thought about all of those things and focused them into originally 10 questions. And then one of my bosses in state archives asked me to add the 11th question, which was, what does it mean for you to be indigenous in what is now Maryland or the Delmarva Peninsula? And originally, when we contact communities, it was supposed to be an Eastern Shore Maryland focus, but we were able to have the Nanticoke Indian tribe participate. So we kind of tacked on the rest of Delmarva Peninsula.
Cool. Our friends from the Maryland Center for History and Culture are here. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Their education department would like to know, are there any plans to interview and empower nations not considered state or federally recognized? How do you think sovereignty plays into the history that we share?
That's a very good question. To be completely factual, the only community that was state recognized in this project were the Pocomoke Indian tribe and the Nanticoke tribe of Indians. I'm not the greatest person to answer this question, but recognition for either federal or state is one that's a legal process, and it's one that you have to go through in order to acquire it. So it requires lawyers. It requires vast amounts of time. These are bills that are passed through senates. It's a whole legal process. And so sovereignty by definition is one that it varies depending on what community you're with. There are many different definitions. There's many different people interpret sovereignty very differently. By definition, most people say that sovereignty can only be had through a recognition process, and that minus a recognition process, sovereignty is one of those things that you do not have. But it also leads to the question of, do I not have innate sovereignty that does not require a federal or state recognition? So it's, as I said, I'm not one of the best people to answer this. But can you reiterate the question one more time?
Yeah. The last part of the question was, how do you think sovereignty plays into the history that we share?
Great. So I think most communities feel themselves sovereign in the textbook definition as self-governing nations. Like, they view themselves as independent. They view themselves as we have our own tribal councils, we have our own tribal leadership, we have our own laws and bylaws. So we view ourselves, though members of the state, members of the country, we view ourselves very much as having almost very much a separate government and a separate system of laws that correlate as well with regular state and United States laws. But so I think many communities interpret that sovereignty differently, but I think it's also their right to tell their history from their own experience, and allowing them to be the authors of their own history. Again, federal and state recognition, though incredibly important, is one that is a legal process. And I don't think we should be stifled by that process, because not every community is able to go through that process currently. It's a very expensive process, and not everyone has the financial ability to do that. So I don't think we should discount anyone's oral history. I don't think we should discount anyone's, tribal status based on a government standing.
Seems like a really socio-political issue.
It is.
Yeah. Patricia says, Wanishi, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Wanishi, can you define the term lifeways? Also, is the term remnant, a colonial term, part of the 19th and 20th century salvage anthropology?
That's a great question. So lifeways are things such as crafts, dance, hunting, fishing, things that are endemic of that community. So things that community views as so much a part of who they are that it is a way of life, that by trapping, hunting, fishing, doing a particular craft, maintaining a particular dance, that without it, they would have a sense of loss or a sense of misunderstanding about themselves. So if a community wasn't able to, such as the Mayaisuwàk, for example, if they weren't able to trap the muskrat, they would have to figure out another way to define themselves as a people, because that is a huge defining thing. This is what we do as Mayaisuwàk people. Like, we trap the muskrats feed us, the muskrats clothe us. And say the muskrats hypothetically go extinct, they would have to find an entirely new way to define themselves. One of the conversations we had was, with climate change, much of their territory will be underwater. And so how will Mayaisuwàk people define themselves? What will their lifeways be that define themselves when they can no longer have a connection with their territories or homelands because they're inaccessible due to water? And it was a really powerful question that we kind of came up to. So it's one of those things that lifeways are activities, dances, that are defining for that community, that give meaning, purpose, heritage, culture, definition to them. Remnant is definitely a modern terminology. It's definitely one that's used by some communities. It is a 19th, 20th century, 21st century term. I personally am not the biggest fan of remnant, but it is one used in literature for multiple tribal communities that show that not everyone was removed, which is clearly shown not only through the state recognition process, but the fact that Maryland has 6 tribal communities, many of whom are on the Maryland Commission of Indian Affairs, but that these individuals, though not huge numbers of them, massive numbers of them stayed in the area, that population stayed. and that those who are tribal communities today are the descendants of those populations who stayed within that geographical region.
Wonderful. And before we close today, I just wanted to let you know, Drew, that there are so many comments here that say how wonderful this presentation was, what a great resource you've helped to create. It looks like we have Elaine here from the MSA. She says hello. And that's all the questions we have time for today. So thank you so much for this amazing content. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. Thank you to the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for today's program. And thank you all to our audience for joining us this afternoon so we can make these programs possible. Everyone take care and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.